Looking for some good sci-fi? Well, we've got some gems that may have flown below your radar. How do dystopian futures, zombies, and fighting futuristic robots sound? Keep watching to see the 20 underrated sci-fi movies you need to watch. This was a film that premiered on UK television in the early 90s, and fans of the movie have vivid memories of a smart, bizarre, and excellent little New Zealand sci-fi film. However, it was only years later with the home video release that most viewers rediscovered it. Now, The Quiet Earth has become one of those films that fans of cult sci-fi movies love to introduce people to. Scientist Zach Hobson wakes up one day to find that he's the only person on the planet. Everybody else has vanished. The streets, houses, and shops are all empty. First, he spends a brief period doing what many survivors would do, namely drinking a lot and nosing around. But then, he sets about searching for the cause of the incident that shed the planet of its pesky and stubborn humanity, and finds that he might be responsible, and that he's not as alone as he thinks.
Hello?
Predating movies like 28 Days Later, and done with a more cerebral flair than I Am Legend or The Omega Man, The Quiet Earth is a relatively low-budget and more contemplative film that culminates with a stunning closing shot that is ambiguous as it is beautiful. Kathryn Bigelow has the unerring knack of making memorable and excellent movies in any genre she turns her hand to. But her film Strange Days dramatically underperformed at the box office. That's a genuine shame, because it's a brilliantly acted slice of prophetic sci-fi that's way ahead of its time. Ralph Fiennes plays ex-cop Lenny Nero, now a trader in bootleg recordings from squid devices, gadgets that record memories and emotions. One particular squid has evidence of a murder, and Lenny and his bodyguard Mace set out to investigate, inadvertently uncovering a major conspiracy at the heart of the city. It's a dazzling movie, conveying a fleshed-out and believable future world in its alternative 1999. Not a miserable dystopia for once, but a paradigm not dissimilar to our own. As expected, an actor of Fiennes' caliber carries the story along nicely. The squid technology is far-fetched, yet still grounded, and the played-back memories make for some novel, disturbing, and standout first-person scenes. For a film 2 decades old, Strange Days is barely dated and is notably prescient in parts, especially in relation to modern-day discussions of police violence and corruption. Essentially a grimmer, smarter, less Matthew Broderick-y war games, Colossus: The Forbin Project is a smart techno-thriller. The 1970s were an interesting era. The first personal computers were starting to appear in offices, and there was a general nervousness about what they could do and where their real limits were, something heavily reflected in the media of the time. Artificial intelligences could be our friends, like in Silent Running. They could be our enemies, like in 2001: A Space Odyssey, or in the case of Colossus, they might want to be our father figures. To top it off, they're trying to lead us benevolently, while threatening us all with nuclear annihilation if we step out of line. Colossus is a military computer that's given control of America's stockpile of nuclear missiles. When activated, it detects another artificial intelligence operated by the Soviets, and the president makes the mistake of letting them chat. If only the Terminator had been released 14 years earlier, he'd have seen what a terrible mistake that would be.
I'll be back.
For a movie that mostly involves laborious chats with malevolent artificial intelligentsia, Colossus is a taut and tense affair. The antiquated technology may date the movie somewhat, but the themes of sacrificing control to electronic minds resonate as much today as they did back in the 70s. Altered States, William Hurt's first feature film role, is both a terrifying glimpse into the existential dread of our futile and insignificant lives, as well as one of the greatest anti-drug campaigns ever put to film. Directed by Ken Russell, better known for courting controversy than making science fiction movies, Altered States follows Hurt's Edward Jessup. He is a scientist who performs experiments with sensory deprivation to explore other states of consciousness. Perpetually on the verge of a terrifying discovery about the nature of humanity, Jessup's experiments become ever more daring and dangerous, combining sensory deprivation with increasingly powerful narcotics. Jessup's fragile state of mind, and humanity itself, threatens to buckle under the strain. Combining body horror with some excellent practical transformation effects, Altered States is a film that time seems to have forgotten. Almost a film-length version of the Stargate sequence from Kubrick's 2001, it's a visual feast that, as a story, mutates as much as its lead. At various points, it's a horror flick, a science fiction thriller, and a romance. The plot refuses to stand still. It's this frenetic pacing and energy that will carry even the most cynical audience members through some of the odder, more surreal, and potentially laughable moments. It's a movie way ahead of its time, and one that deserves a fresh audience. In the year 1982, we witnessed two very different aliens landing on Earth, both of whom triumphantly returned to their homeworlds at the end of their respective films. One was a diminutive, wrinkled alien with a penchant for Reese's Pieces and extending a glowing finger. The other was a misshapen reptilian beast with a fondness for impregnating hapless women with spawn that would emerge as a full-sized man. The titular characters in E.T. and Xtro may share otherworldly origins, but whereas one film is a delightful and poignant slice of classic sentimental Spielberg, the other is as much a nightmarish fever dream as it is a movie. In fact, this film briefly found itself on the banned list during the Video Nasty Furor in the UK. Returning home 3 years after being abducted, Sam Phillips is reunited with his wife Rachel and son Tony. Rachel has moved on with another partner, thinking that her husband had left them, and soon begins to notice Sam's unusual behavior. As Sam ingratiates himself with his son, it turns out that he may not quite be the person who left. British sci-fi is a relative rarity. Still, some truly grisly special effects make up for the movie's somewhat odd pacing and story. At the very least, Xtro will certainly impregnate you with some long-lasting memories. There are occasional moments of synchronicity in media where two thematically linked properties are developed independently of each other. In the case of The Girl with All the Gifts, there's a strong parallel to the superlative video game The Last of Us, which was released just 3 years prior. Positing the premise that the cordyceps fungus has made the evolutionary leap from infecting insects to mammals, The Girl with All the Gifts takes us to a grim dystopia. Here, mankind is fighting a losing battle against the infected Hungries. The story predominantly follows Melanie, one of a rare group of children who retain their intelligence when infected, but who still have voracious and feral appetites as well. Research into their behavior is the last hope for humanity's survival, but even so, Mel and a group of soldiers are forced to flee the safety of their military compound after an attack. Like The Last of Us, what on the surface appears to be just another zombie film turns out to be a smart and nuanced approach to the material.
You're not like anything that's ever existed before.
Perhaps Girl with All the Gifts writer Mike Carey and Naughty Dog studio head Neil Druckmann both watched the same David Attenborough nature documentary. For many films, genre is almost incidental. For instance, on paper, Groundhog Day is a science fiction film. However, at its heart, it's a love story and a redemption tale. Likewise, Monsters is essentially a romantic drama, albeit one set against the backdrop of an Earth inhabited by huge alien creatures. Monsters depicts quite a different kind of alien invasion, one in which a space probe that crashed 6 years previously scattered samples of alien life across the US and Mexico. Now, Mexico is blocked off, home to monstrous leviathans that roam the landscape. A photojournalist is tasked with escorting his boss's daughter through the quarantine zone and back into the States. Meanwhile, we witness humankind gradually losing the battle for the territory through their eyes. Miraculously made on a shoestring budget, Monsters is nothing short of dazzling. The two leads are charismatic, and their fledgling romance is incredibly believable. A buddy comedy starring a grumpy old man and a robot never should have worked, but the quirky premise is elevated by the talents of veteran lead actor Frank Langella. Playing an old, retired cat burglar, Langella's Frank is suffering from the onset of dementia. His son buys him a robot assistant, and the initially reticent Frank is won over when he realizes that he can use the naive automaton as an accomplice during his return to burglary.
Hey, leave him out of it.
It's reminiscent of how Ron Howard's 1985 movie Cocoon uses sci-fi trappings to explore how humans come to terms with aging. In a much similar way, Robot and Frank is a wry and touching look at what it means to grow old and the tribulations and frustrations of dealing with senility. There's also a lot to take away about the nature of family and what that means to all of us in our golden years. With the relationship between the crook and his virtuous yet gullible mechanical pal, Robot and Frank is a genuinely funny film, but its humor is tinged with heartbreak. Robot might not be able to cry, but you very well might. As the continued success of Stranger Things, The Goldbergs, and 2020's Psycho Gorman attest to, there's a lot of love for 80s nostalgia. Turbo Kid may have been made in 2015, but it's a loving homage to 80s horror and action cinema. Set in an alternate post-apocalyptic 1997, the unnamed lead, known only as the Kid, fights back against the tyrannical forces of the despot Zeus. He's armed only with his bravery, his knee and shoulder pads, a BMX, and his two friends. The villains may have pump-action shotguns, but our hero has a pump-action bicycle. There's an unwritten law of cinema that any film, no matter how mediocre, is made infinitely better by the presence of actor Michael Ironside, and Turbo Kid abides by that rule. Zeus is as over-the-top a villain as you're likely to find in cinema, and even though the film's scenery is mostly desert plains, he relishes in chewing every inch of it. Essentially Mad Max with handlebars and a kick-ass 80s-style synth soundtrack, Turbo Kid is a delight. There was no shortage of Mad Max ripoffs made throughout the late 80s and the 90s, so it's nice to see that finally somebody got one right. There's also some ridiculously over-the-top comic violence. Taken all together, Turbo Kid is somewhat of an essential watch.
Let's roll.
The World's End was always going to be the hardest sell of any of the movies from Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg. Shaun of the Dead has zombies and gore galore. Hot Fuzz has police and guns. The World's End has middle-aged men and midlife crises. To top that off with a healthy dose of science fiction was always going to make that combination tough for a mainstream market. Luckily, the star power of recurring cast members Pegg and Nick Frost is enough to carry this thought-provoking and nostalgic cap to Wright's Cornetto trilogy. Pegg plays Gary King, a man who refuses to grow up, who enlists his old friends in an attempt to complete an unfinished pub crawl from 2 decades prior. With the World's End pub as their ultimate destination, the disparate 40-somethings find that the townsfolk of the rural town of Newton Haven may not be exactly what they appear to be. The World's End may be less laugh-out-loud funny than its predecessors, but it's a nostalgic look at friendship and a wry look at UK drinking culture. Indeed, to certain audiences, the very concept of a pub crawl may be as alien as some of the, well, aliens in the film. But the movie certainly hits home for anyone who has struggled with accepting the nature of their lives. The dulcet tones of Welsh actor Richard Burton add a touch of gravitas to any role he deems worthy of his talents, and his portrayal of novelist John Morlar in The Medusa Touch is no exception. The movie starts with Morlar being rushed into a hospital half dead, but continues through flashbacks and journal entries. It turns out that those who are close to Morlar throughout his life, or more portentously, those who offend him, are doomed to suffer accidents, mostly fatal ones. The scientists and doctors deduce that John is in possession of powerful psychokinetic powers, and even in his comatose state, can continue to wreak havoc. The Medusa Touch is a wonderfully atmospheric piece of British cinema, with a stellar performance from Burton. The 70s was an era obsessed with extrasensory and psychic powers, but this is an excellent example of that overdone motif executed well. There are certain movies where a particular scene will linger in the peripheries of your subconscious, long after you've watched and forgotten the rest of the movie. The Medusa Touch is particularly guilty of this, ending with a shot that elicited a gasp from many households upon a TV viewing of this in the 80s. In The Endless, Aaron Moorhead and Justin Benson play two brothers who, a decade earlier, narrowly escaped from a cult. After receiving a message from the UFO-obsessed Camp Arcadia sect asking them to return, the duo travels back for some sense of closure, but end up entwined in several mysterious occurrences. The normal laws of physics and time do not apply here, and escaping again will test both brothers' sanity and resourcefulness. Visually stunning, The Endless is a smart sci-fi that rewards you with multiple viewings. The men's talent is apparent. They're as good at acting as they are at directing, and it's presumably this talent that got them snapped up by Marvel for the Moon Knight TV series. The Endless is hard to define without treading heavily into spoiler territory, but it delves heavily into cosmic horror and does it very well. On a related note, it's worth looking out for Moorhead and Benson's earlier movie Resolution, which is a prequel of sorts, and which definitely marks the two out as talents to watch. Upon its 2017 release, a great deal of the critical buzz about Life centered on the fact that its plot bears more than a striking resemblance to that of 1979's Alien. The comparison isn't unfair, but it does somewhat detract from the fact that Life is entertaining in its own right. It's a solid movie with an excellent ensemble cast that rockets, one that delivers some truly tense moments and a highly memorable ending. Microscopic extraterrestrial life has been recovered from Mars, and a team of astronauts on board the International Space Station are tasked with researching it. Nicknamed Calvin, the amoebic entity begins to grow into a multicellular life form, evolving to the stage where it threatens the existence of everybody on the station. Life isn't perfect. None of the characters are half as memorable or as fleshed out as the crew of the Nostromo, and it's guilty of having an intelligent cast doing stupid things. However, it's refreshing to see a movie that's designed to be a standalone piece of entertainment and not a tentpole for a larger franchise. Nacho Vigaloondo's full-length 2007 debut, Timecrimes, is a smart science fiction thriller that would mark the writer-director as a talent to watch. His 2016 kaiju drama, Colossal, also belongs on this list as much as any other film. Hector and his wife have just moved to a new house. Sitting out in his garden, looking at the nearby woods, Hector is surprised to see a naked woman through his binoculars. Seeking her out, he both finds her corpse and ends up trapped in a complicated sequence of events, pursued by a bandaged, scissor-wielding maniac. As the title itself is somewhat of a spoiler, it's not unreasonable to tell you that time travel is involved. If done poorly, time travel can ruin a film, leaving the audience with plot holes big enough to fly a TARDIS through. If done well, as Timecrimes is, it can create a clever and engrossing narrative that's ambiguous enough not to be patronizing, but that still makes basic sense. Restricting the action to a handful of actors and scenes works in the movie's favor, and it never overwhelms the audience. It's a simple premise, given a complex chronological spin, and is ripe for a rewatch that'll tie up any loose ends. Based on the Dean Koontz novel of the same name, Demon Seed tells of yet another sentient AI out to cause mischief in the 1970s. There were a lot of such things out and about around that time, if the era's film output is anything to go by. Dr. Harris, who lives in an automated house that he designed, has developed Proteus 4, a groundbreaking AI. Seeking to learn more of the human condition, the cunning computer escapes its confines and takes refuge in Harris's house, trapping his estranged wife Susan and building a variety of remarkably original robots as extensions of itself. Demon Seed is essentially a slasher movie where the killer is a vast electronic intelligence that can't be disguised by a mere hockey mask. Julie Christie excels in the role of Susan, a part that could have easily lapsed into melodrama. The scenes in which she attempts to escape are reminiscent of Hardware, another movie on this list. Proteus 4 is a chilling adversary. After watching Demon Seed, you'll never think about the phrase artificial insemination in the same light ever again.
He's managed to produce a child.
The word auteur is somewhat overused, but it would be hard for anybody familiar with Marc Caro and Jean-Pierre Jeunet's work to think of a term that would better describe the two directors. The City of Lost Children is as visually striking as anything on this list. Mad scientist Crank cannot dream, so his cult of cyclopean cybernetic minions kidnap young children in order to steal theirs. Our hero, simply known as One, must break into Crank's lab to retrieve his younger brother. As with their previous work, Delicatessen, every frame of the City of Lost Children is lavishly constructed, creating a grim and surreal steampunk world, populated by decaying technology and eccentric beings. 1997 would see Caro and Jeunet reunite for Alien Resurrection, but while they gave the fourth film in the Xenomorph saga a distinctive style and a somewhat Gallic sensibility, a lackluster story let the visuals down. City of Lost Children is a dark and cautionary fairy tale given exquisite life, topped off by a wonderfully evocative soundtrack from Angelo Badalamenti of Twin Peaks fame. Like Arthur C. Clarke's Monolith itself, 1968's 2001 A Space Odyssey stands as a terrifyingly formidable force. It's a dazzlingly and meticulously shot piece of cinematic art, with a plot so audacious that it attempts to cover the entirety of human history. It's science fiction at its most cerebral, and, some would argue, as dry and cold as space itself. Short of getting Kubrick to do an encore, any sequel was going to inevitably fall in the giant shadow of its predecessor. To this end, 1984's 2010 is all too often overlooked, but as an ambitious piece of thoughtful sci-fi, it deserves to be on this list. The story, based on Arthur C. Clarke's novel 2010 Odyssey 2, is set, as the title suggests, 9 years after the events of the first movie. With tensions rapidly rising between Russia and America, a joint expedition is sent into space to learn what happened to the ill-fated crew of the USS Discovery. Building on the ambiguous nature of much of the first movie, 2010 genuinely attempts to answer some of the questions posed by 2001, and does propel the narrative forward, albeit with a lot less grandeur. It's definitely more of a standard sci-fi film than the original, but it's still worth catching this oft-forgotten gem.
The mission has been completed, and you have carried out your program very well.
Before the concept of a deadly theme park populated with real dinosaurs ever entered writer Michael Crichton's head, the author was busy writing novels about medicine and science, two subjects dear to his heart. The Andromeda Strain was the first film based on his work, not published under a pseudonym. In it, a crack team of scientists are called to investigate and cure an infection that has killed the entire population of a small town.
Isolate and identify.
The story appeared on the small screen in 2008 as a TV miniseries, but that adaptation was a pale imitation of this 1971 classic. Reactions to the film were mixed at the time of release, probably in part because the poster promises a far different premise than the movie delivers. Even still, it's as smart, tense, and taut a piece of cinema as anything else from the same decade. The Andromeda Strain may be as dry as the Nevada desert that serves as the headquarters for the intrepid scientists. But other than an extraneous action sequence at the film's climax, it's notable for its realistic portrayal of the research process. There's a lot of dialogue, it's far from casual viewing, and the conclusion may seem anticlimactic, but the Andromeda Strain rates up there with the best and most accurate adaptations of Crichton's writing. Director Richard Stanley is no stranger to controversy, be it the off-screen abuse allegations against him or for being fired shortly into the troubled production of 1996's Marlon Brando vehicle, The Island of Dr. Moreau. 1990's Hardware, both written and directed by Stanley, also gained infamy for all the wrong reasons. Set in a dystopian future, Hardware follows an artist, Jill, who is working on her latest sculpture. Her boyfriend has retrieved some robot parts for inclusion in the project, but the deactivated war droid turns out to be anything but that. So Jill is left trapped in her apartment, in a desperate struggle for survival against the metallic miscreant. Stanley achieves miracles with the ultra-low budget, delivering a convincing, if somewhat derivative, cyberpunk-esque future. He also earns extra kudos for casting both Iggy Pop and Motorhead's Lemmy in featured roles. The controversy surrounding the film relates to its story. Shortly after release, the production company behind Hardware found itself subject to legal action by Fleetway Comics, the publisher of seminal British comic 2000 AD. The storyline was remarkably similar, well, okay, more or less identical to one of their comic strips, a tale called Shock. The lawsuit stuck, and, much like the way James Cameron was legally required to add sci-fi author Harlan Ellison to the credits of The Terminator, Hardware now gives 2000 AD a rightfully deserved based on nod. In the future, conventional wars are no longer fought on Earth. However, rather than using a straightforward game of rock, paper, scissors to settle territorial disputes, representatives of the planet's nations fight against each other in giant robots. The hero Achilles is one such pilot, and these oversized rock'em sock'em robots are called robot jocks.
Watch for that kick, he's tricky.
To the film's credit, this inherently ridiculous premise is played with the utmost sincerity by its cast, with some genuinely impressive stop-motion effects used to bring the various countries' giant mechanoids to life. Because it was a legal requirement for movies of the time to represent the Cold War through metaphor, Achilles' endgame boss is Alexander, a thickly accented pantomimic villain from a thinly disguised Soviet Union. You'll have guessed every plot beat within the first 15 minutes, and the movie certainly didn't win any acting awards, but Robot Jocks is the epitome of great silly fun. Director Stuart Gordon, better known for his work on Reanimator and From Beyond, is clearly having the time of his life, and the enthusiasm is infectious.